Discovery of the empty tomb. The 10 apostles had gathered on the evening after the Sabbath in the house of John Mark. They felt safe there, and they had taken up the offer to stay the night as well. They were lying on the same couches they had used during the Last Supper. Only Thomas was not there on this Sunday morning. Thomas had been with them for a few minutes late on Saturday evening, when they first came together, but the sight of the apostles, combined with the thought of what had happened to Jesus, was too much for him. He looked at everyone, then silently left the room. Full of grief and confusion, he went to Simon's house in Bethphage, where he mourned his difficulties in solitude. In the house of Joseph of Arimathea, there were 20 prominent female believers who had set the goal of redoing the embalming of Jesus' body after the Sabbath. They were desperate because they had learned that the tomb was now guarded by soldiers, and that a second heavy stone had been rolled in front of the tomb, both stones secured with Pilate's seal. Nevertheless, early on this Sunday morning, at the first light of dawn, 5 of these women set out for Jesus' tomb. They had prepared a large amount of special embalming oils and brought linen wrappings with them. Their intention was to anoint Jesus' body more carefully and wrap it in the new linens. These women were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of the Alphaeus twins, Salome, the mother of the Zebedee brothers, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, and Susanna, the daughter of Ezra from Alexandria. It was still very early in the morning when these brave women, burdened with their ointments, arrived at the empty tomb. As they were leaving the city gate, they encountered a number of soldiers who were fleeing into the city, more or less in panic. To their great surprise, they saw that the 2 stones that were supposed to close the entrance to the tomb had been rolled away. On their way, they had been worried about this and had said to each other, "How will we get the soldiers to leave? And who will help us roll away those heavy stones?" Their surprise quickly turned to fear, and trembling with dread, Mary Magdalene dared to walk around the stones and enter the open tomb. When Mary could look at the place where the Master's body had lain, she immediately saw that it was gone. In the niche where they had laid Jesus, Mary saw only the folded cloth where his head had been, and the wrappings in which he had been bound. These were intact and lay exactly as they had been placed, except there was no body inside. The cloth that had covered the body was neatly folded at the foot of the niche. She let out a cry of shock and fear. All the women were extremely nervous and tense, and when Mary cried out in fear, they were seized with terror and fled in panic. They did not stop until they reached the city gate. But then Joanna composed herself and realized that they had left Mary Magdalene behind. She gathered her friends, and they set out for the tomb again. When they reached the tomb, the fear-stricken Mary Magdalene rushed toward her sisters and exclaimed excitedly, "He is gone, they have taken him away." She led them to the tomb, and they all went inside and saw that it was empty. The 5 women then sat on the stone at the entrance and discussed the situation. It simply did not occur to them that Jesus had risen. They had had no contact with others during the Sabbath, and they assumed that the body had been moved to another resting place. But as they considered this solution to the dilemma, they could not understand the fact that the burial cloths were left in such an orderly state. How could the body have been removed if the wrappings in which it had been bound were still exactly in place? It seemed as if the body had dissolved. As these women sat there at dawn, they looked aside and saw a silent stranger standing motionless. For a moment they were afraid again, but Mary Magdalene ran up to him, spoke to him, because she thought he was the gardener. She said, "Where have you taken the Master? Where have they laid him? Tell us so that we can go and take him back." When the stranger did not answer Mary, the tension overwhelmed her, and she began to cry. Then Jesus spoke to them and said, "Whom are you seeking?" Mary sobbed, "We are looking for Jesus who was laid to rest in the tomb, but he is gone. Do you know where they have taken him?" Jesus then said, "Did this Jesus not tell you, even in Galilee, that he would die, but also rise again?" These words startled the women, but the Master had changed so much that they did not recognize him, especially since he stood with his back to the still faint light. While they pondered these words, he addressed Mary Magdalene in the familiar voice, saying, "Mary." And when she heard her name, spoken with that well-known loving tone, she knew that this was the Master's voice, and she rushed to him to kneel at his feet, crying out, "My Lord and my Master." And all the other women recognized that it was Jesus who stood before them in glorified form, and they knelt before him. The eyes of these 5 women were enabled by angels to see the Morantia form of Jesus. When Mary tried to embrace his feet, Jesus said, "Do not touch me, for I am not as you knew me in the flesh. In this form I will remain with you for a short time before I ascend to my Father. But now go to my apostles and Peter, and tell them that I have risen, and that you have spoken with me." When these women recovered from their amazement, they hurried back to the city and to the house of John Mark. They told the 10 apostles everything that had happened to them. The apostles were, however, reluctant to believe them. They first thought that the women had seen a vision, but when Mary Magdalene repeated the words that Jesus had spoken to them, and when Peter heard his name mentioned, he rushed out of the upper room, followed by John, in great haste to reach the tomb and see these things for himself. The women again told the other apostles how they had spoken with Jesus, but they did not want to believe them. They did not even want to investigate, as Peter and John did. As the 2 apostles ran to Joseph's tomb, Peter's thoughts were swinging between fear and hope. He feared meeting Jesus because he was ashamed, but his hope was kindled because, according to the women, Jesus had sent a special message to him. He was half convinced that Jesus was truly alive again. Suddenly he remembered the promise that he would rise on the 3rd day. Strangely, this promise had not occurred to him since the crucifixion, until this moment, as he hurried through Jerusalem to the garden tomb. As John ran after Peter out of the city, a strange ecstasy of joy and hope welled up in his soul. He was half convinced that the women had truly seen the risen Master. John, who was younger than Peter, ran faster and arrived at the tomb first. John stopped at the entrance and looked into the tomb, and saw exactly what Mary had described. Confused, he concluded that everything they had used on Friday afternoon was there, but the lifeless body was nowhere to be found. Shortly afterward, Simon Peter arrived, and he immediately entered the tomb. When he went in, he also saw that there was no body, but the burial cloths were strangely collapsed. After Peter, John also went inside and carefully examined everything. Then they sat down on the stone to think about the meaning of what they had seen and heard. As they sat there, they recalled everything that had been told to them about Jesus, but they could not form a clear picture of what had happened. Peter first suggested that the tomb had been robbed, that enemies had stolen the body, and that the guards might have been bribed. But John reasoned that the tomb would never have been left in such an orderly state if the body had been stolen, and he also wondered how the wrappings could have been left so clearly intact. And again, both went into the tomb to examine the burial cloths more carefully. If at that moment their spiritual eyes had been opened, they would have been able to see Jesus just 20 meters away. When they came out of the tomb for the 2nd time, they found Mary Magdalene, who had returned and was crying at the entrance. Mary had gone to the apostles, believing that Jesus had risen from the tomb, but when everyone refused to believe her story, she became emotionally unsettled. She longed to return and be near the tomb, where she had heard the familiar voice of Jesus. Peter and John had seen enough and decided to go back, leaving the confused Mary behind. When they had gone, Jesus appeared to her again, saying, "Do not doubt, have the courage to believe what you have seen and heard. Go back to my apostles and tell them again that I have risen, that I will appear to them, and that I will soon go before them to Galilee, as I have promised." Mary hurried back to Mark's house and told the apostles that she had spoken with Jesus again. But once more, they did not want to believe her. Yet Peter and John were uneasy, they were restless and afraid.